This presentation will continue addressing the focus question, how can nutrition and recovery strategies affect performance, focusing specifically on nutritional considerations. The link to syllabus and this presentation will focus in depth on pre-performance nutrition, including carbohydrate loading. When considering pre-performance nutrition, one cannot dismiss the importance of carbohydrates. 6 to 8 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates is recommended per day in the week prior. This is to help the body to be able to produce energy when they are undertaking intense physical activity. And you can see in the table that as physical activity increases, the recommended level of carbohydrates also increases. And you can see that at moderate to high intensity, such as endurance training, 4 to 6 grams per kilogram of body mass is recommended. As the intensity increases to high and very high, you can see that up to 8 grams per kilogram of body mass is recommended. And whilst it is important to consume the appropriate amount of carbohydrates prior to performance, it is also important to consume the appropriate type of carbohydrate prior to performance. And it is recommended to consume moderate to low glycemic index foods due to the sustained release of glucose into the blood. If you have a look at the graph, you can see that foods that have a high glycemic index, in the graph you can see, such as jelly beans, glucose is released into the bloodstream extremely quickly. However, if you have a low glycemic index food, such as baked beans, the glucose is released into the blood much more slowly and leads to a more sustained release of energy for the athlete. Foods with high glycemic index produce a fast, high rise in blood glucose levels. However, foods with a low glycemic index produce a slower and lower rise in blood glucose levels. It's important to understand that moderate to low glycemic index foods are better for sustained release because they provide a more continual supply of glucose over a longer period of time. Foods with a high glycemic index release the glucose very, very quickly and is used up very quickly, leaving very little for the rest of the activity to come. You can see in this table a list of foods that are considered high glycemic index, moderate glycemic index, and low glycemic index. So foods with low glycemic index, if we look at the bread section, you can see that whole grain breads and multigrain breads are considered low GI, so they would be better to consume pre-performance because of that more sustained and slow release of glucose into the blood, which allows the glucose to be available for a much longer period of time. It's important pre-performance to consume a meal 3 to 4 hours prior, which is low in fat but high in carbohydrates. It is recommended to consume 2 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight, and a tomato-based pasta is recommended because it is low in fat but still contains the pasta, which is high in carbohydrates. 30 minutes before performance, it's important not to consume a meal that is too heavy, and carbohydrate drinks and gels are perfect to top up the carbohydrate levels and allow the athlete to move into their performance with adequate fuel. It's important pre-performance to avoid certain foods, particularly foods that are high in fiber, because they can actually encourage the athlete to want to go to the toilet, and high fat foods because fat takes a long time to digest and can still remain in the stomach as the athlete is moving towards their performance, and that is not ideal. In terms of hydration prior to performance, it's important to consume 500 to 600 mils of fluid 30 minutes to 1 hour prior to performance to maintain fluid intake and also to ensure that the athlete avoids dehydration during the activity and to maintain heat balance to ensure sweat function works appropriately. Moving on to carbohydrate loading. Carbohydrate loading is a process used by athletes, particularly those athletes that take part in moderate to high intensity endurance events that last 90 minutes and over, for example, a marathon. Carbohydrate loading also involves an exercise taper for 1 to 4 days along with a high carbohydrate diet. And this includes 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight. Carbohydrate loading is important because the athlete, when they're about to participate in a really intense long distance activity, it's important that there is plenty of glycogen stored in muscles prior to the event so that the athlete has enough energy to complete their event. The idea of carbohydrate loading is to fill up or top up the muscle glycogen prior to the event. Experts recommend low glycemic index foods during the carbohydrate loading phase to ensure sustainable release of glucose into the blood. A sample carbohydrate loading meal would include plenty of carbohydrates such as breads, cereals, fruits, and starchy vegetables. Carbohydrate loading is thought to increase muscle glycogen levels by 50 to 100% and thus can increase performance by 2 to 3%. So elite athletes are likely to use carbohydrate loading to give them the edge against their opponents. In elite endurance events such as marathon, triathlon, road cycling, and long distance swimming, carbohydrate loading can be very beneficial, particularly when combined with tapering, which includes a gradual reduction in workout demands, reduced strain on fatigued muscles, and this allows the muscles to retain the stored muscle glycogen and give them plenty of glycogen to complete their activity or their event. For carb loading to be effective, an exercise taper of 1 to 4 days is recommended. This doesn't mean that the athlete completely rests. It just means that they scale back the intensity of their training to save the glycogen for the actual event.